In this episode, we're going to talk about how you can play Star Trek Adventures online. This is STA Engage. Welcome to the show. I am your host, as always, Dr. RPG Jeff Harvey. In the last episode, we talked about how you can understand, create, and use mission briefs. And if you have any questions about those, crafting stories for your Star Trek game or anything like that, it's a good place to start. So you can check that out. And if you have any other questions that you want us to answer, any topics you want us to cover, or just thoughts and feelings, send your questions to questions@staengage.com. We're going to do a Q&A episode at the end of season 1, so send your thoughts and whatnot in. In this episode, we're going to be joined by a special guest, one of the STA community leaders, the sole moderator of the Star Trek Adventures subreddit, the prolific writer of close to 20 STA adventures. You can download and play from various places. I think DriveThruRPG has most of them. And a master of playing Star Trek Adventures online, Mr. ELH. ELH, how are you?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
I'm pretty good. I like your uniform. It's pretty fancy.
Thank you.
The goal of this show is to help Star Trek fans and role-playing fans better engage with the Star Trek franchise as a whole, and the game and the community at large. This show is brought to you by the letter H, the number 5, which is something. I had that one for Voyager season 5. The name of the episode is Flesh and Blood and Voyager season 5. There we go. I remember now. All right. The support of people like you. And so like, subscribe, share, and support us on Patreon if you can. If you want to find out more about the folks that sponsor the show or put the show together, our production team at Studio Tembo, or the folks over at Continuing Missions, sta.com, or our primary sponsor for this season, Adventure Inc., just follow the links below and you can find anything right there. So before we get into too deep into talking about how to play online, ELH, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, who is ELH?
So ELH, the person, I am more or less a game master of only 7 or 8 years. I haven't been at this, super long compared to other people. But it's one of those things where I sort of started with Dungeons and Dragons, as I think most dungeon masters do. And don't get me wrong, dungeon mastering for D&D was nice, and I think I'm preempting a question here. It was one of those things where I eventually encountered Star Trek Adventures through Shield of Tomorrow, which is, I think, how most people initially got involved with it, because, Star Trek Adventures was sort of that niche sort of system that not many people knew about out of Modiphius. But what I did is, obviously, I was an avid fan of Star Trek. I looked into Star Trek Adventures and I fell in love instantly. I pretty much have been running it for 3, almost 4 years at this point, something close to that. And it's one of those things where, because I was already such a fan of Star Trek, that, running Star Trek Adventures, writing Star Trek Adventures, it just became sort of a hobby that I fell in love with all over again.
Right. So between all the games you've played now, you've done Dragons, Star Trek Adventures, what's your favorite game?
Oh, hands down, it has to be Star Trek Adventures. There's just so many unique things about this system that I think does almost, I don't want to say fan service to Star Trek Adventures, but I mean, it's pretty close to what I'm thinking of, in that it really feels like you're running an episode of Star Trek if you do it right, where it really feels like you have meaning both as player and game master on both sides of the table, that you're contributing equally to a shared narrative, which you can get that with games like Dungeons and Dragons and other systems. But I feel like Star Trek Adventures does it so well that it just comes so naturally compared to other systems.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You've written a lot of modules for Star Trek Adventures. I think I said before, you can get most of them on DriveThruRPG. I'm not sure where else they can be found, but feel free to let us know. So how many have you written, and what's your favorite module that you've written?
Well, they're also available on Continuing Mission. I am a contributor there, so you can get them Continuing Mission, DriveThruRPG. They're on my Patreon, but they're for free, so you don't actually have to pay anything. But in terms of module writing, I think I counted it up the other day. It was something like 22, 23.
Yeah.
But I think my most favorite module has to be SciShift. And for those who don't know, SciShift is basically this semi-horror, semi-spooky episode where the players are more or less drawn to Sci Station, this random outpost on the edge of space, via a very disturbing distress call. But when they get there, they find out that everything's fine. And it sort of becomes this exploration of what is fear in the context of Star Trek, what is fear in the context of a tabletop role-playing game. And it's one that I've gotten the most feedback about. And it's actually somewhat of a polarizing topic. Either you have people that really buy into the concept and love it, or you have people that don't do horror and they hate it. So it's a really interesting thing to see where people stand on it.
Yeah, I've never been comfortable with doing horror in Star Trek, but I like the tension. I have seen that adventure. I haven't run it yet, but I've taken a couple things from it. So I think I have most, if not all, of your stuff so far. I've gone through, or at least read most of it. So how much experience do you really have running the game? I know you said about running the game online. Really, I know you said you've been running the game for about 4 years or so. How much that's been online?
All of it's been online.
Okay.
In fact, I've pretty much only done online games since 2016. So it's one of those things where I feel like I have a lot of experience with the online game mastering perspective. But of course, I'm always learning and growing. So
Sure. What's the platform that you primarily use?
Definitely Roll20. I've been a pro subscriber at Roll20 for probably about the same time I've been game mastering Star Trek Adventures. So,
all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about how to run a game in online. So how do you go about finding players for a game? What are your avenues for searching out players?
So this is where I start to differ from other game masters, or at least that's the feedback I keep getting. I actually treat the player finding experience much like almost like a job application. All I do is I fire up a simple Google form. I ask a series of questions, and then I actually, do interviews with people that I feel would be good fits for the game. So it's one of those things where if they pass the interview and they have a schedule that lines up, they have a working webcam or mic, depends on the game. We move to, all right, let's do a session 0. Let's get everybody at the table together, well, the virtual table together. And then if that goes well, then we actually have a game. And the benefit to doing that is, yes, it does feel like a job application. Yes, there are people who are going to write a bunch and not get in. But the benefit is that you're going to have players that really mesh well together, players that generally won't have a whole lot of problems. And especially for at least my perspective, I'm running streamed games. So I have to make sure that the players are going to be on time, that they're going to show up with the level of commitment needed. Obviously, if you're running just non-streamed games, you can get away with a hell of a lot more. But that's basically how I go about getting a group together for a game.
What kind of questions do you normally ask in your interview process?
It's honestly not that bad. I usually ask, okay, how much experience do you have with Star Trek Adventures? How much experience do you have with tabletop role playing? Is there any particular position you want to play, like a captain, chief engineer, things like that? Is there anything that you think I should know about your applications, like preferred pronouns? Anything you want me to know about your character's backstory? Very simple sort of application that lets the potential player sort of fill me in based on what they think is important. And I think that that's better than, going through a list of like 50 questions, because nobody's going to do 50 questions on an application.
Right. Absolutely. What kind of limitations do you find there to be online play?
Well, the one thing that I initially shifted away from was microphone only. Obviously, you can run a game microphone only, but I really feel that sort of visual experience that we're doing right now, you sort of need that in a game like this, especially when you get to the heavier topics, which Star Trek does occasionally. You sort of need that visual feedback, that visual body language, which even with webcams, you can miss something really important. But I don't know how much you want me to delve into that, because I could go on for that for ages.
Oh, we are going to talk about the different video platforms and some of the drawbacks and advantages of those. I will agree, though, that while most of the games I run right now, we don't use cameras, which it's mic only over Discord, and we use Fantasy Grounds. I like the experience of being able to have that I like one of the things that I find it lacking is that you don't get that table read. You can't read the room as effectively, and I think that is a serious drawback to not using web cameras. And again, even with web cameras, I think you'd still miss a lot of that. So, what do you think the benefits of playing online are?
Well, one of the benefits, obviously, of playing online is that we're in the middle of a pandemic, so we can actually, play a game together on the internet. The other thing that I like is you don't necessarily have to commit a full sort of 5 hours to a game. Like in college, for example, when I was game mastering, I would have to set aside an entire night. But somehow online, people are a little bit more stringent about schedules where, all right, we're going to play for 3 hours. We're going to play for 3 hours and we're not going to have too much, table talk. Whereas if you did it in person, inevitably you'd order pizza or some food, or, we'd get on some random tangent and you'd be there for 5 to 6 hours kind of a thing.
Yeah, I do find that there's a lot more, as you said, being stringent with their timetables. That has definitely been an advantage for my games. We end up doing table talk before the game. We try to make sure that, because we're all friends. The group that I play with are really all have been very close for a long time. I think the shortest amount of time I've known anyone in my current group is my wife, and that's been 15 years. So I definitely agree with you there. There are, like I said, we do some tabletop beforehand where we can get together and talk and get things out of the way. So that's a good thing for those of you who have a hard time, even with online games, trying to get people to settle into their characters. And that's something you do at an actual table too. So we talk about virtual tabletops, and you run Roll20, and I'm used to mostly using Fantasy Grounds, but those are not the only ones out there. There's Astral and Foundry and Tabletop and Let's Roll, that's ROLE, Tailspire, Tabletop Simulator, which I find absolutely abysmal, mostly just because I think it's not intuitive at all. And there's many, many more. So why did you choose Roll20 over all the other options?
Well, it was one of those things with Roll20 where I initially got into it again because of Dungeons and Dragons. So a lot of the features like dynamic lighting, API access, a lot of that I needed for my games at the time. Honestly, at this point, though, it's just what I know best. I can spin up a Star Trek campaign, and have it ready to go within 10 minutes. And that's including things like a technobabble generator, challenge dice macros, NPC macros, and all the good stuff. Would I ever switch to another virtual tabletop? Maybe. I've been looking at Foundry. It has intrigued my interest, but it's one of those things where I would have to commit to learning Foundry over Roll20 again. But I do agree with what you said earlier. Tabletop Simulator is almost a step even further away from running in person because of how much they put importance on the visual aspect of things. And it's, as you said, it's not really intuitive for the end player. Plus it's what, $30 that everybody has to chip in. Right. Whereas something like Roll20 or Foundry, the cost is on the GM. So
now I will say that Tabletop Simulator, for people who are playing board games, that's what it's designed for. So it may have its advantages there. I do own it, mostly so I can play Hero Quest, but it hasn't come up because I can't figure out how to use it properly. I will say that Fantasy Grounds doesn't have any official support for Star Trek Adventures right now, although they have been working on it for a painfully long time. There's a couple people who in the communities, if you're on the Facebook and whatnot, who are the Facebook groups that show regular screenshots of it and taunt us with the fact that it is not out yet. There is a fan created module. It's hard to find now because they've stopped advertising that it's available with the new module coming out. It works fantastically if you can find it. There are some flaws, but it's fan made and it is what it is. I personally like it. So when you're using your virtual tabletop, what are you using it for primarily? What's the purpose? Are you using maps, and are you doing like grid maps and having miniatures and all that stuff, or are you doing more of a theater of the mind style that just happens to have a component of a virtual tabletop?
So, and this might be tooting my horn a little bit here, but it's a mixture of both. And it's one of those things where if you look at most any Star Trek Adventure stream that isn't Shield of Tomorrow or what's their new one, Clear Skies, what you see is that same mixture where you do have sort of these set pieces like the bridge, sick bay, other sort of Star Trek set pieces that you can find online. that you throw tokens on just to represent who's in the scene. But then now and again, you have actual like gridded combat or gridded maps with dynamic lighting and things like that. And I think there's a reason why people, again, that are streaming have mostly adopted this thing that I've done, is because it really works for Star Trek, where, you know, D&D, you need to have maps for almost everything. Star Trek, you can just throw up an image, do theater of the mind a little bit, and 9 times out of 10, you're good to go. And when you do need to do a map, it's very easy to sort of slip into that gridded mindset compared to other systems.
Yeah, especially when Star Trek uses more of a zone-based combat anyway, so you don't actually have to have a grid. I do something very similar. I'm said 90% just theater of the mind. I use the images to help engage a lot of characters. Any NPC that has an image, you know, any NPC they encounter has an image. Every ship they encounter has an image. I try to image out scenes too. Like there was a bit where my crew encountered 3 Cardassian warships, and I had an image of 3 Cardassian warships that was a really nice image that I found online. And I think that really does help with the immersion, especially when you're not sitting at a table anymore. And in a lot of ways, I think it's actually one of the major benefits of playing online is you get that visual representation that you wouldn't otherwise. So for video and voice, what do you use for your video and voice? I know Roll20 has a built-in built-in audio system, but I don't think they have video, do they?
No, they've got video, but I don't know anyone that actually uses Roll20 video and audio.
Yeah, me either.
It's one of those things where, again, I'm a little bit unique because I'm doing the streamed games. I actually prefer Zoom because Zoom is one of those very few platforms that has both HD and allows you to actually manipulate the order in which webcams show up in a meeting. You can't do that with Discord. Discord has... even if you're one of those, what are they, Nitro subscribers or whatever,
right?
You get a little bit of a bump, but it's really, you start taking a hit in quality. And to my knowledge, there's not really a way that you can manipulate, order of operation here. So it's one of those things where you would have to re-edit your OBS settings every single time. Whereas Zoom, you just have people turning on and off their webcams at a certain order, and you're good to go.
Right. I use Discord personally. For most of my games, mostly because the audio quality is superior to Zoom, in my opinion. It's substantially superior, especially if you are a Nitro subscriber, which I am. I can get 96K for those of you who are trying to figure out audio stuff. Whereas so far with Zoom, I found it somewhere around 48. I'd have to look to see for sure the numbers though. And I know there are other platforms out there too. Like I know people who were using Facebook Messenger for a little while, Microsoft Teams, which I don't recommend. Mostly it's just a resource hog is all. There's also Google Meets. We used to use that years ago when I first started doing online. So it's really kind of what you find to be the most effective. And if you are streaming, I would agree that Zoom is probably the way to go because of the multi-channel video recording. And you can actually all record your audio tracks independently, which you can't do with any other platform, that as far as I'm aware. So how do you run your games? What's your prep planning like? What's your schedule look like when you're running games?
So that's a very involved subject, so I'll try to keep it brief. But what I usually do is I set aside maybe 1 to 3 hours every Sunday, or really sometime during the weekend, and I just sit down and I more or less hammer out, okay, here's the general plot for the episode. How do I get from point A to point B? And then are there any NPCs, any set pieces I have to develop? Trying to think about how to say this. It's one of those things where I don't do the same level of prep I would have to do for Dungeons and Dragons, where I would have to sit down and I would have to plan out entire conversations, entire NPCs, because, and this might just be me, but I find that taking more of an improv approach to scenes and NPCs seems to work out a hell of a lot better than, having like, oh, they're in this part of the conversation, I have to drop X, Y, Z. Whereas with improv, it comes more naturally. So I would definitely say I'm more of an improv GM than I am a scheduling GM. But at the same time, I'm almost mid-session. I'm developing ways to sort of not divert, but otherwise sort of guide the players towards whatever story I have for that week.
Sure.
Now, of course, there's challenges with that, where if the players do truly go off the rails, you're sort of left scrambling for, okay, how do I get them to here? What do I do now? But again, I just have a lot of experience with improv. So I'm really good at sort of taking whatever the players are doing and twisting that into a Star Trek feel, quote unquote.
Sure. That's how I've always run my games. I've always been kind of a prep later kind of guy. So I do find that Star Trek Adventures really lends itself well to that sort of narrative as well. Especially with if you have a couple of basic challenges you could laid out, you can just kind of fit those in where you need to and get players where you need them to be. At least that's been my experience so far. How do you deal with like scheduling with your players? You just have a set schedule? Do you guys communicate? What do you use to communicate? That kind of stuff.
We actually do use Discord, ironically enough, for most of our logistics. It's one of those things where it's part of the actual application process I mentioned earlier, where I make sure everybody commits to a singular time, a singular day, whether we're weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, whatever it is, we commit to it. And then if a player obviously is going to be out or they have a problem or a family emergency, they just let me know through Discord. And then either if they're pivotal to the episode or if we can get away with them not being there, we can run without them. But it's one of those things where I'm somewhat of a stringent person where I sort of give people like two chances. Like they have to, if you're going to be out and you know it, let me know. Obviously, family emergencies, handle in real life stuff. But if it's one of those things, again, because of a stream game, if you don't show up to the game and I don't know why, we start to get into that discussion of, are you still committed to this game kind of a thing?
Sure. Yeah, which is absolutely, I think it's a good thing to get into a habit of that anyways in any game. I think if players can't commit to the game, it's disrespectful to the game master. And especially when you've got an audience relying on that game, it's important. So you use Discord for most of your logistics. Do you have any, what kind of technical challenges are there for the games you're running online? Like you talked a little bit earlier about macros that you use. Like what kind of stuff do you do to make your life easier when gaming online?
Well, macros are a big one. If set up properly, you can do macros for pretty much anything. What I love is NPC macros, and I'm pretty sure now that I think about it, there are at least 2 articles by me on Continuing Mission about how you can leverage, especially in Roll20, how you can leverage macros to make your life as a game master a lot easier. Now, what these macros do, for example, is let's say we're in Starship Combat. It can roll pretty much all of the NPC dice, all the ship dice for different tasks. It can auto roll damage. So all you have to do is push one button and you get immediate feedback that you just look at, grab what you need and go. Whereas, I only have experience with Roll20. I'm sure there's a way to do something similar in the other systems, the other platforms. But for me, it saves me at least a minute on average every time I push that macro button. There's also things like the Technobabble generator, which is quite literally stolen from the operations book of Star Trek Adventures, where I took the time to put in all the rollable tables. And so that you just have to push a button and you get a list of Technobabble you can use. And it's one of those things where I found it's really helped the players having something like that, where they're stuck. They don't really know what to Technobabble their way out of something. They push the button and they go, oh, I'm recalibrating the multiphasic ionic variance array. And I'm like, okay, that sounds good. Have a momentum kind of a thing.
Right.
Technical challenge wise, though, really it comes down to, does the internet feel like playing nice today? If the internet is not playing nice with you, then you're kind of SOL. The other thing that especially in my case, because I use Zoom for everything, is unlike Discord, there's not really a way to adjust individual audio levels. Right. So you're sort of at the mercy of the player setups, where if it's not set up properly, you have to do a lot of technical work. And that's partially why all my sessions meet like 30 minutes early, just to handle any technical difficulties at the time.
See, I have one advantage over some people is I actually have a mixer that everything goes into. So you can't see because my microphone's in the way, but that thing back there handles all the audio for me, so I can up and down. It is a little bit more difficult with a computer setup like this because I only have one fader at the moment. There are ways to do it where you can do multiple, but unless you're going to spend a lot of money on your streaming setup or you're just, game with friends, I do not recommend trying to get into using professional grade audio gear. Zoom does a good enough job at leveling people out for the most part. And a little bit of education on how to use a microphone is all you really need. So Yeah, I don't have much else for that. I do have a question though. What you talked about a macro for NPCs, and you talked about the ship being able to click a single button. Is that what you're talking about when you're talking about NPC macros, or do you have something else that you do with macros?
Well, I also have things like, okay, does the NPC need to roll like a presence and a command? And it's one of those things where I could actually generate up a full sheet. The way it works in Roll20, for those who don't know, is basically you click a few buttons, it asks you some questions, and it does the rolls for you. That takes time. So by having that NPC macro already pre-done, all you have to do is, again, push a single button, get instantaneous feedback on whatever they're rolling.
Right.
And that includes things like focuses and things like that.
So are you creating the NPCs in the system and then having it roll based on that? Or is it just kind of randomly creating all the numbers? Or you're entering the numbers in, I guess?
A little of both. It really depends on the NPC in question. Like if it's just some random troop or one random Romulan Uhan, then
Right.
yeah, it's more on the fly. But if it's like a major NPC, like say Locutus, I haven't dropped Locutus on my players, but we're going to use him as an example.
Right.
Locutus will have an actual like full character sheet that I'll roll from.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Where do you get like images and stuff? Are you just like, where are you getting your resources from?
Google mostly. ArtStation's another good resource. DeviantArt, you do have to wade through a lot of stuff to get good stuff on DeviantArt, but I think it's worth it. There's also Pixiv. A lot of people don't know about Pixiv because they sort of look at it and go, oh, that's just Japanese art. But surprisingly, there's a lot of things on there that you can use for your Star Trek games if you know what you're searching.
Right. I guess the last question I really have going on this is not as an art, but do you use audio? Do you use any sound effects or something like that with your games?
Yes and no. It really depends on the game in question. And again, it's different for me because I do streamed games, and especially with all the new DMCA nonsense at Twitch, I have to be really careful what I use for sound effects because I can get dinged and get DMCA'd for it. Which, speaking of, fair warning for anyone looking to use DS9 sound effects, someone is not with Paramount and CBS, but claiming DS9 sound effects, even like bridge beeps on YouTube. So don't use DS9 sound effects. Yeah. Everything else seems to be fine so far.
Yeah. I tend to use Sirenscape a lot. And Mr. Loomis, Ben Loomis, is a friend of a previous show I did. And I really like his stuff. So if you're looking for sound effects, that kind of thing like that, I recommend for most users, I recommend their stuff. I don't think their sci-fi stuff is real great for Star Trek, but it's good for almost any other game. All right. That's all I've got. Do you have anything else you want to
add? Not really. I can't really think of anything else.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess my final thought for this episode is we live in interesting times, and the COVID crisis isn't going anywhere anytime soon, regardless of what you may read elsewhere. It may be hard to sit around a table with your friends and play your favorite games for a while, but don't let that get you down, and don't let it stop you from telling the stories that you really want to tell. It's a great, big, beautiful tomorrow right now. You can reach out and touch the entire world without leaving your house. It's easier now than it has ever been to get started role-playing. You have the protection of and privacy of your own computer screens, a wonderfully accessible game that is set in a very bright and hopeful utopia. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of nerds who want to spend just a little bit of time with you, sitting around the flickering glow of your computer screens, telling stories to help keep away the darkness. It's not exactly how our cave-dwelling ancestors did things, but you can scratch that ancestral itch, grow your tribe, and indulge in a little escapist fantasy without having to clear your browser history afterwards. And on that note, we're going to call it a wrap here. Next time on STA Engage, we're going to talk about, we're going to talk once again with Jim Johnson, the one and only. We're going to sharpen our batleths, unleash the targs, and drink some blood wine as we talk about everyone's favorite murder hobos. I'm looking forward to this episode. So stay tuned next time for Way of the Warrior, or if winning is not important, then why keep score? Until then, if you like what you see here and like what you hear, you want to help the show, just do us the favor and share this episode with one other person. That's all we ask. Share with one other person, a player, fellow game master, Star Trek fan, D&D fan, anyone who might get some enjoyment out of our show. Please share it with them. Until then, I am your host, Dr. RPG, and on behalf of myself, my guest, ELH, my co-host who was not here today, Michael Dismuke, and everyone who works behind the screens here, live long and prosper.